All right, again, we'll have, as you can see, how this works. So we'll try to have the Zoom on the review session, and again, that's going to be from 1 to 2, and then you can get in by using the personal ID and the password. And if you get on the 105 folder down at the bottom of the, in 105, there'll be it has the link for Zoom, but it's just my phone number, office phone number, 517 blank 607 blank 2376, and then Wolfram is the password with a small W. All right, the band pick of the week is Rolling Blackouts, Coastal Fever. That's the name of the band. Okay, so has anyone ever seen Rolling Blackouts or listened to them? No? Okay. They're you guys looking for more, musicology here. All right, they're from Melbourne. They're an Australian group. They're an indie rock band, and they started in 2013, and they're basically put together, they had 3 singers, guitarists, and they put together a band, and they've got, I think, two albums out. So you might just get on Spotify or Pandora or whatever, and or YouTube, and take a look at them. Last time we were talking about, we started to talk a little bit about bureaucracy. And then in bureaucracy, we mentioned that he said bureaucracy in a private firm looks a lot like bureaucracy in the governmental structure. And Mises writes a whole book in 1944 where he talks about, it's called Bureaucracy. So you can, if you get further interested. But he says, look, if you look at something like General Motors, its organization looks a lot like the government, in that in the government you might have a Secretary of Health and Human Services, and then you've got bureau chiefs and like assistants to the secretary and all that stuff. And then if you look at General Motors, you might have a chief executive officer and a board of directors and the person in charge of North American operations. So these things look very much the same. Now, if you think about it, what we've been talking about is that there's something that in the market capitalist system that is revealing to you, right? Because information is decentralized. We're talking, only you know how many hot dogs you want and stuff. But we have a signal on what we ought to be doing in the market system, and we said, what is that? Prices and profit, right? That lets us know where we should be moving resources about, right? If there's economic profit to be made, what will happen? We'll start moving resources that direction. If prices are going up, then what's going to happen? We're going to produce more. Okay? So if we look at the bureaucracy in government, it's different than that. I took a leave in January of 1991 to be Deputy State Treasurer, to do the taxation policy for John Engler when he was first elected governor. So he was elected in November of 90, and it started in January. So I took 3 semesters off and the 2 summers and went up and I did the tax policy for the administration. And but I was in charge of the taxation piece, and so I had the bureau chief for the single business tax, which we had at the time, for the income tax and for the sales tax, etc. So how was I to know that my bureau chief in charge of the single business tax was doing a good job or not? Pretty hard for me to figure that out, right? The only way I might have an indication is if the lobbyists for General Motors came in and said, oh my gosh, the way the single business tax is being collected, or the forms, or et cetera, this is a real problem. We need to deal with that, right? So maybe I'd know because the lobbyists are coming in. But I didn't have a good mechanism to know how well my bureau chiefs were performing. Whereas if I were the CEO of General Motors, and I'm looking to see if the vice president in charge of North American operations is doing a good job, I'm going to look and say, hokey smokes, Bullwinkle, we just lost $500 million last year in our North American operations. Maybe I should look into replacing the vice president in charge of North American operations, right? So Mises' point is that as everything else in the market system, prices and profit are giving you information. So even though it looks similar to a bureaucracy in the governmental process, large corporations still operate in the same fashion that we've been talking about before. That is, they have to produce things that consumers value, and maybe the mechanism by which we organize ourselves may change over time. In fact, we've seen that. If you look at in the last 10 or 15 years, a number of corporations have sort of decentralized the decision making, so that people who are closer to the everyday actions of the company have more decision making that they can make. They don't have to go and ask the vice president whether we can do this. They just have the ability to make that choice. And we'll talk more about that when we get into Hayek's Constitution of Liberty. But the way that we organize ourselves in a bureaucracy may look similar, but it's not going to be the same. And so before we close this section, we've talked a good deal about that market capitalism creates wealth for the masses, and things are fairly obvious if you just sort of look at it. But and I've again put on in the Econ 105 folder. Actually, I think it's just in the Wolfram folder. The Heritage Foundation's Economic Freedom of the World Index, and we've got the Fraser Institute's, both of their annual reports. And so again, I've referred to it before, but just today I thought we'd just go through the Fraser Institute report. Their latest one is the 2019 version. I haven't checked in the last week or so. I don't know if they've released the 2020 one yet, but I don't think so. But anyway, again, you can get, if you go to the Fraser Institute, you can get off their website. You can get this. That's where I've been getting it. But the bottom line is they have 2017 rankings if you look at their 2019 report. But if you look at the countries that are in the top 10 in economic freedom, I'll just read through them quickly. Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, Switzerland, the United States, Ireland, the UK, Canada, Mauritius, and Australia. If you look at the countries that are in the bottom, that is ranking them from the least economically free, they're Venezuela, Libya, Sudan, Algeria, Angola, Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Egypt, Congo, and Iraq. Now, they don't rank North Korea or Cuba. So, again, where do you want to be poor, right? I mean, you don't want to be poor in Angola. You don't want to be the poorest person in Angola. You'd rather be the poorest person in Ireland. If you look at the Heritage Foundation, it's a little bit different. There is Singapore first and then Hong Kong, and they give 2020 rankings. This is from their 2020 report. So Singapore, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Australia, Switzerland, Ireland, the UK, Denmark, Canada, and Estonia. So a number of these things are the same. The United States is only 17th ranked under Heritage, as opposed to being 5th ranked in 2017 by the Fraser Institute. If you look at the countries that are in the bottom, it's North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, Eritrea, the Republic of Congo, Bolivia, Zimbabwe, the Sudan, Kiribati, and Timor. So, again, you don't want to be poor in those bottom ones, right? You know you want to be poor in the top ones, whether it's the Heritage indices or the Fraser Institutes. Now, one nice thing about the Fraser Institute is that if you go to the exhibits in their report, it gives you rankings or gives you an analysis of the different countries, looking at those that are in the top 25%, the middle 25, and then the two middle 25%, and then the bottom 25%. So they give quartile rankings, and they give you data on it. So I'll just give you a few of them here. If you look at economic freedom and income per capita, if you look at the countries that are most free, the income per capita is $36,770. If you look at countries that are in the least free, it's $6,000. Okay? So income per capita is over 6 times greater in countries that are in the top 25% of economic freedom than the bottom 25%. If you look at life expectancy of people in the most free is 79.4, and the least free is 65.2, right? So life expectancy is 14 years greater if you're living in a country that's in the top 25% of economic freedom. If you look at income earned by the poorest 10%, like we don't do per capita, we notice per capita was 6 times higher. If you look at income by the bottom 10%, it is $10,646 in the most free and $1,503 in the least free. So you are nearly 10 times wealthier, at least 9 times wealthier, if you're in the bottom 10% of the income distribution, if you're living in a country in the top 25% of economic freedom. So, Mises is saying, market capitalism is the only place that creates wealth for the masses. This should make it obvious. The World Bank has what they call measures of extreme poverty and moderate poverty. Extreme poverty is $1.90 a day, and moderate poverty is $3.20 per day. If you look at countries that are in the bottom 25% of economic freedom, those in extreme poverty, 27% of the population lives in extreme poverty if you're in the bottom 25%. If you're in the top 25% of economic freedom, it's 1.82%. So less than 2% living in extreme poverty if you're in the most free. If you're in the least economic free, it's 27% of the population. So again, should make it clear that Mises was correct. And again, if you look at infant mortality rates are more than 6 times higher in countries that are in the bottom 25% than those in the top 25%. If you look at the income shares of the poorest 10%, it's greater in those that are in most free than the least free. So just to give you an idea, if you go to the exhibits in the Fraser Institute, they have a number of exhibits that basically make these points that Mises was making back in 1927. All right. That brings us to the chapter 4, where he talks about the relationship between liberalism and political parties. Okay? And he says that liberalism is not a political party. He makes this distinction. Liberalism is not a political party. And what is it? It's a philosophy. He makes this point early on, right? What's his logic here? He says the only way to create wealth for the masses is to have a market capitalist system, but that requires a political philosophy that's consistent with market capitalism. And we went through the foundations of liberalism. And notice on the midterm, that's what I'm going to probably ask you that question about why does he include this particular foundation of liberalism, let's say peace or whatever, and you got to explain how does that work to make it so that market capitalism can be a success. Then he says that, you know what? He's noticed this movement towards central planning, right? Anti-liberal thought. That says, hey, anti-liberal thought is starting to dominate these places. And he says, could liberalism have maintained the power? Could have maintained power by compromise? That is, okay, suppose that lots of you think the minimum wage is a good idea, okay? So we think, hey, we ought to have a $15 an hour minimum wage. If we were to do that, then we would say, hey, you know what, we can stay in power if we just went ahead and say, yeah, minimum wage, we're fine with that, right? Now, that is not consistent with classical liberal thought, right? Because government's role is supposed to be limited to the protection of life, liberty, and property. It's not supposed to go out there and set prices of wages or things like that. Okay? But we'll just compromise on that. What he said, here's the quote. He says, the ultimate and most profound of the fundamental insights of liberal thought is that it is ideas that constitute the foundation on which the whole edifice of human social cooperation is constructed and maintained. Right? It's ideas that constitute the foundation on which the whole edifice of human social cooperation is constructed and maintained, and that a lasting social structure cannot be built on the basis of false and mistaken ideas. Okay? If you were to compromise, it can't work. Okay? He says, one of the fundamental insights of classical liberalism is that it's ideas that are important. That's what forms the foundation of of society. And this, when he talks about the system of social cooperation, what does he talk about? Market capitalism, right? We talked about how pencils get here, right? And all the coordination that you need to have pencils get here. It says, nothing can substitute for an ideology that enhances human life by fostering social cooperation, right? That's market capitalism, least of all lies, whether they be called tactics, diplomacy, or compromise, right? So compromise is not what you do, right? You don't compromise your ideas in order to get to maintain your power. Now again, on any particular bill, let's say you were in Congress, right? On any particular bill, you may vote on a bill that has 80% of the things that move you in the right direction and 20% are moving in the wrong direction. You don't get perfect bills. But he's not talking about pieces of legislation here, right? He's talking about ideas. He's talking about, are you going to say, here's what we believe in, and we believe in this thing, even though we don't really believe in it. We believe in this thing because that'll keep us in power. You guys will go along with it, right? So again, he's not talking about particular pieces of legislation here. He says that the only way to lead the world back to liberal thought is to convince people it's necessary for the well-being of society. Right? So it's ideas that are the important thing. And how do you go about persuading people? You go about persuading people about the ideas by telling them it's necessary, right? This is important. You're not going to tell them, oh yeah, well, you could be a classical liberal, but you might not be, and it'd be nice if you were a classical liberal, but hey, it'll be close, right? No, he says that you have to convince people it's necessary for what? For the well-being of society. And what does that mean? Create wealth for the masses, right? And so he says, page 3 of the book, what does he start talking about? Page 3 of the book, he's talking about how we're going to have general collapse of the world economic system, right? He talks about how we're going to have World War II, and he talks about, we're going to have the Great Depression and World War II, and we're going to, prohibition's going to fail, and that the fascists are going to start World War II, and that's going to lead to all these problems, right? And so he's trying to alert people in the book that say, hey, this is important, this is necessary that we do that. So he's explaining here, when you go out and try to persuade people in order to make the market system functional and have all those things that we talked about in terms of the economic well-being of folks, that you got to persuade people that it's important. Then he says, there's no other way out of the political and social chaos of the day, right? That we have the political and social chaos of the day, right? There's no other way out. And just think about that. Remember, 1927, Mussolini hasn't invaded Ethiopia yet, right? It's not going to happen for another 9 years. So if you sort of think about what does the political and social chaos of 1927 look like, and then look at what do we have today, right? Today we have political and social chaos going along, right? We have, what's our relationship with China look like right now, okay? What does our relationship with Russia look like right now? How is it that we've had this war in Afghanistan for decades, right? What's going on in Iran, right? What's going on with this nuclear arms agreement? What's going on in Portland, okay? Do we have political and social chaos today? We probably do, okay? How do you get out of that? You get out of it only one way. There's only one way to get out of that, is to have people believe in classical liberalism. Just imagine if everybody in China were classical liberals, okay? Imagine if everybody in Russia were classical liberals. Imagine if every place was a classical liberal. Well, would you have the conditions that you have today? Would you have this, a war going on in Afghanistan? What's one of the foundations of liberalism, right? It's peace, okay? If everybody were a classical liberal, then you wouldn't have the problems that you have worldwide today. And that's what he's saying in 1927. And he says the only way out of this is to persuade people to be classical liberals. We can't just elect a new president and somehow Joe Biden's going to solve all the problems with China and Iran and Iraq and Afghanistan, and somehow just electing the right person is going to solve the problem. That's not what he's saying. It's going to be, the only way out is to persuade people about classical liberalism and try to do that. Then he says, okay, you're going to have a problem in making this argument, just making your arguments, just alerting you. Okay? He says, what's going to be a problem in persuading people? He says, basically, the masses have not been taught to use logical thought. Right? They tend to go along with it being more persuaded by appealing to emotions or whatever. And notice that this whole thing we've been talking about is logic, right? That's what we've been focusing on, right? How does the market system? It's a system based on voluntary exchange, which means I got to pay the opportunity cost of resources, which is their value in the next best alternative. And then I got to make something of greater value to consumers, or I go out of business, right? There's a logic to that, right? All the foundations of liberalism, they're there, right? For why? For a reason, because that's the political philosophy necessary to make that market capitalist system work. Okay? So it's a very logical argument. He says that's going to be a problem because people haven't been taught to think logically, and that is part of a problem today. All you got to do is listen to the political debates, right? How many colleges do you think require people to take a class in logic and rhetoric, right? You do here, but probably lots of places you don't learn much about logic. Even how you learn to read rather than phonics, you learn whole language or whatever, right? Which is a less logical way to live. So to recognize stuff rather than logically sounding out how things work. Okay, so that's a problem that he tells us about. Is that you're just going to have to focus on getting their attention to start with. We've talked about this. Maybe you appeal to their emotion to start with, and then lead them through what the logical argument is. Then he says, when people are confronted with immediate gain that results in long-term detriment, what are they going to do? They're going to choose the temporary gain. Right? People will choose basically immediate gain and long-term costs over short-term costs and long-term gain. Okay? So, again, if you take Professor Clark's behavioral economics class, okay, he'll talk about that, right? But Mises is, he's well before behavioral economics became, a major topic in economics. But he's just pointing this out. If what you do is you come up and you say, hey, this government program is creating all sorts of problems, you're going to have to give up this, benefit that you're getting from this program. But what's going to happen is we're going to get all this positive economic feedback 2 years from now or 3 years from now. People will tend to choose the short-term gain and the long-term costs over a short-term cost and long-term gain, just from a behavioral economics standpoint. And again, if you're trying to persuade people to move away from a centrally planned state to a system of market capitalism, you're going to have to demonstrate to them and convince them that the long-term gains are greater than the short-term costs and overcome this, this problem that you have. Then he says, you can't win, liberalism can't win using the tactics of political parties. You can't use the tactics of political parties. Because remember that, he's focused several times on liberalism as a philosophy and not a political party. He says that market capitalism got rid of the idea of social castes, that it got rid of the idea of classes. Because why? Because one of the foundations is equal treatment under the law, right? And he says that it was when capitalism happens, that's when you first get that people begin to have a voice in how their government's run. Remember, one of the foundations is democracy. So you don't have democracy, again, when we read How the West Grew Rich, we'll talk more about this, but you don't have democracy in 1310, right? We have a feudal system. You don't have democracy there. When does democracy really start to come about on a grand scale? And again, we'll talk more about this when we read How the West Grew Rich. You had, Athenian democracy perhaps, but as a whole, you don't get democracy until market capitalism really starts to show up. And so again, he's saying that this is what, that there's going to be this participation in democracy, but one of the issues that you have to worry about is what Madison talked about in Federalist number 10. Again, you've probably all read the Federalist Papers, but if you haven't, you will. Madison in Federalist number 10, what does he talk about? He talks about factions. But if we were using today's language, these would be special interest groups. And he says, Madison's talking about a threat to democracy, being factions, but basically special interest groups. And he says, what will they do? There's an incentive, right? There's an incentive to use government to benefit their members. So that what Mises is saying here is that, look, political parties are essentially combinations of special interest groups. And again, if you take my Econ 415 class, we spend a good deal of time talking about this, because what we do is we use economic analysis to look at how the political system works, right? And we look at lobbying and how that, what are the incentives of lobbyists, and what happens if you make the law this way versus that law, law that way, et cetera. But Mises is making the point here is that a political party is not a political philosophy. A political party is essentially what Madison was talking about, these factions, these special interest groups, and they tend to either be a particular, if you're the Green Party, maybe it's only one special interest group, or it could be the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, that are combinations of special interest groups. So for example, if you were to look at the National Manufacturers Association, what party do you think they're a supporter of? Yeah, the Republican Party, right? What about the United Auto Workers? What are they? What do you think they are? Labor unions? Democrats? Yeah, Democrats. The Democrats, right? So if you start to look through, what happens is they tend to be special interest groups, tend to have one political party or another. And again, in Econ 415, we explain why that's a function of the way that we have the way we do elections in the United States, not having a parliamentary system, but having winner-take-all elections. But nonetheless, his point is that, hey, political parties will tend to what? They'll tend to use the government to make their members better off. And he says, classical liberals can't do that, right? You're not going to use the tactics of political parties in order to accomplish this movement towards liberalism. He also says that there's no conflict in a capitalist system between classes, however you define classes. However you're going to define that. For example, there's no conflict between producers and consumers, or between the owners of corporations and the labor. But if you listen to the news or whatever, there's a tendency to act like that's true, that there is a conflict between the owners of General Motors and the unions. But if you think through, how does markets work? If I own a business, I want my labor to be as productive as possible, right? Because I'm going to get more profit if I have productive labor. And so I'm going to want to train you, right? I'm going to want to give you machinery or computers or something to make you more productive. And of course, as you get more productive, what we talked about, how do you get paid? You get paid the value of your marginal product. And so there's no conflict between the labor and the owners of capital, or there's no conflict between consumers and producers. The only way I can get wealthy is to do what? Is to produce something that you guys value more than the opportunity cost of the resources that went into it. So what am I trying to do? I'm trying to figure out what consumers want. We've talked about this many times. That's what I'm trying to do. And so he's arguing in this chapter that you have a political philosophy and there's no conflict between, he says, classes however they're defined. and because everybody gets, equal protection under the law is one of the foundations of liberalism, and the mechanism of market capitalism says, hey, as an employer, I'm better off the more productive you are, so I'm going to try to make you productive. If I'm a producer of goods, I got to figure out what consumers want and try to please them. Then he says that the political parties formed by special interest groups will have trouble keeping the parties together. Because we said political parties tend to be groups of special interests, right? In a given political party. And again, if you take Econ 415, we talk about, again, why it is that you only have two major parties in the United States, whereas you have multiple parties in other countries. It's because of the way the electoral system is set up. But nonetheless, it's clear that the Republican Party or the Democratic Party are made up of different special interest groups. And what he's saying is they'll be in conflict with another. It may be that your special interest group, you're part of the Republican Party, but my special interest group is part of the Republican Party, and we're going to have a law that is in conflict between the two groups. So, for example, when Bush was running for president, they put a tariff on steel because they were trying to get Pennsylvania to, vote in Pennsylvania, rather than, trying to get the steel workers to be happy with them. Well, that sort of worked, and it was good for the steel manufacturers. But then what do you have? You have the unintended consequences. And so what happened was the auto parts manufacturers that are stationed in the United States, what's going on? Steel's more expensive for them than steel in China is to the Chinese auto parts suppliers. So what happened? What happened was there was a political conflict here. I actually did a little consulting work for the Auto Dealers Association, making the argument that we should get rid of the steel tariff. This is causing these unintended consequences with auto parts suppliers. Now, they did actually end up repealing the steel tariff because of exactly what Mises would have noted. You've got these conflicts between these two different industries, and so. Again, the steel tariff was short-lived. It got repealed, primarily because I wrote such a nice piece on it that it just persuaded the president. Oh, got to get rid of it, or maybe the marginal benefit of my paper was greater than zero, and so maybe that was part of it. All right, but then he says. People have trouble seeing a political ideology, a political philosophy, as anything more than an advocacy for a special interest group. Okay? That is, this is a problem when you go out and try to persuade people of classical liberalism. You just say people have difficulty in seeing a political philosophy as different than advocacy for a special interest. So if what you wanted to do was you wanted to reduce the corporate income tax from 36% to the 22%, which is what happened in 2017, and which is the average of the industrialized countries, where it is now. If you were in favor of that, people would think, oh, why are you doing that? Not because if what I do is reduce the tax on corporate profits, I'm going to do what? I'm going to increase the incentive to innovate, right? I'm going to create the incentive for me to move into this industry if the demand goes up, right? Because I'm going to now be able to earn more economic profit if you reduce the corporate income tax, et cetera, okay? People will say, oh no, the reason that you're doing that is because you're in favor of the capitalists, right? Just listen to the arguments when you, it'll be interesting, there's a debate tomorrow, right? A presidential debate tomorrow. So listen to the presidential debate and see if they're not following sort of the behavioral aspects that Mises is talking about here in liberalism. Then what he does is he closes his book where he says, the West cannot be threatened by outside forces. Right? The West cannot be threatened by outside forces. Okay? And again, he's already told us that the fascists are going to start World War II, right? But they're going to start World War II if what happens? If anti-liberal thought goes along, right? If you move everybody to classical liberalism, if everybody in fascist Germany became classical liberals, or everybody in Italy had become classical liberals, Mussolini would not have invaded Ethiopia, right? Because that's not one of the foundations of liberalism. So he's saying that the West can't be threatened by outside forces, but he says that society will collapse only if the ideas of liberalism lose out to the ideas that are hostile to what he calls social cooperation, right? The only way you can lose is that the West, right? We'll just say, well, maybe put it this way. He says the West can suffer a collapse, right? Only if you lose this battle of ideas, right? That is, anti-liberal thought supersedes liberalism. And when he says that ideas that are hostile to social cooperation, remember that when he's talking about social cooperation, he's talking about, what's he talking about? Market capitalism, right? What do we talk about? We talk about how pencils get here. Why do you believe in peace, right? Because markets can't work if peace isn't there, right? I got to be able to buy product from you. I got to be able to sell product to somebody else. I got to be able to get resources from this point of the world into this other point of the world in order to make Apple iPhones or whatever. Right? And so when he's talking about, whenever he refers to this system of social cooperation, he's really talking about market capitalism. And you need these ideas, that's classical liberal thought, you need these ideas that are consistent with market capitalism to work. And the market capitalism and the West, he says, can't be threatened by the outside forces. That is, it's not a matter of, will the fascists win World War II? Okay? He's saying what's going to lead to the West a collapse of Western civilization is if you lose this battle of ideas. You can't compromise. So you basically have to do what? To articulate to others why this is important. Again, why do I have 4 and 5 essay questions on your exams? Right? I got 70-something of you in the 2 sections. Okay? I got to take all this time to go through and this is a 3 out of 5 or whatever, right? Why am I doing that? because I want you to be able to explain it to somebody. That's what Mises is talking about, right? You got to be able to explain this to other people. And you got to be able to do it in a clear and concise manner in order to get their attention, okay? All right, so we didn't really get around to what I thought we might be able to in terms of answering questions that you might have on the old exams. But what we'll do is on Wednesday, we'll spend part of the time, if you have, let's say you couldn't figure out how to do this particular question on the fall 18 exam, bring that up, and we'll spend some time doing that. And then we will do the law. We'll start Bastiat's the law. Again, the midterm is only going to cover up through Mises. Again, we'll have the review session on Saturday. I'll try and get Zoom to work. And if it does, then we're good. And if it doesn't, then I don't know. Yeah, get the notes from somebody.